So for this question, you are given clear bullet points that you should address in your answer. If you want the top bracket marks, so anything between 6 marks and 8 marks, you should address every single one of those issues and those bullet points. They're there to help you, so make sure your answer covers all of them. What I would do is when I'm answering my responses, I would just tick off every time I've covered one of those points. So I'd start off with a really simple introduction, introduce the issue of people upgrading the smartphones, even though their current phones may still be working. So then you're therefore highlighting the possible impacts of this behaviour. So start off with smartphone users. You might talk about both pros and cons. So pros obviously having the latest technology or applications at your fingertips, increasing efficiency or productivity. That would be probably the main kind of positive point around having the latest smartphones. You might then talk about things like health issues. So, if they're excessively using their smartphone, what that could lead to. So, eye strain, RSI, you could possibly maybe touch on mental health issues. You might even talk about the financial pressure. Then, linked to that, you might talk about the cultural issues. So, things like peer pressure. So, the desire to have a new device and wanting to fit in with your peers. You may also talk about things like new features that the users might require for work and leisure, but that's a positive. Okay, linked to that, you might then discuss environmental issues. So remember, every time you are disposing of a smartphone or a gadget, where does that end up? Okay, so you might make reference to e-waste. That's a technical term there, where your devices end up in landfills. You might also say things around toxic waste and what it releases in the air. Okay, and then the use of non-renewable resources in the production of these smartphones. In terms of ethical issues, you might talk about the digital divide because not everybody can afford it. You might even talk about the social divide because if nobody can afford the latest smartphone, they may not have access to the latest apps. So it might contribute to a social divide in the way that people communicate. You might even talk about social pressures on parents to pay for upgrades for their children. You might even talk about bullying to a certain extent, although I think that might be slightly extreme. But again, it's valid in terms of ethical issues as well. And then potentially you might want to link it into health issues. I would then end with a simple conclusion to talk about. Now, I suppose you'd say, now that I've balanced up the pros and cons, what's your opinion? Whether people should upgrade to the latest smartphones or is there a trade-off? Okay, so I wouldn't emphasize too much on like an introduction and a conclusion. I would probably just keep it really simple and keep it balanced, but I would focus on the 4 bullet points that I've been given in this question. Okay, so for this question, really similar to the previous one, I would briefly introduce the discussion around security systems, specifically with the use of facial recognition and CCTV cameras, and why they are in place. So I would probably start off with the positive and negative impact. You might want to explain the advantages of facial recognition for security and safety purposes in the shopping centre. Remember, a shopping centre is a public place, so in the interest of public safety, you would use this kind of technology as a deterrent for potential crime. In terms of negative impact, you might discuss drawbacks, including ethical and privacy, and maybe weave in some legal concerns as well. So, if we go into ethical issues, you might discuss things like a user might feel safer because they know actions are being monitored and help or actions can be taken accordingly if something happens. But then on the flip side, you might say users feel unsafe or mistrust because they're constantly being watched, or they may not be aware of how this is being recorded, where it's being stored, and who's got access to it. You might then weave in the Data Protection Act or the GDPR laws, and talk about things like, is the data being processed fairly and lawfully? Have they been given permission? Have they got access to their footage? Because users might feel that it's an invasion of their privacy. You might even talk about things like, I suppose you could touch on the Computer Misuse Act, although I think that's a little bit far-fetched. But if you were to weave in the Computer Misuse Act, you might say that that footage, if it's not stored safely and in a secure way, someone else could have access to it and potentially misuse it. You might also touch on things around surveillance. So how do people feel about constantly being put under surveillance as well? And again, that links to kind of ethical issues with trust. I would then end with a conclusion, talk about, now that you've had a balanced discussion, because this is in a public space and there's going to be hundreds and thousands of users coming into the shopping centre, in the interest of public safety, whether you think that this type of technology is effective or not. In this question, you are being tested on your understanding of emerging technologies, specifically using AI to monitor posts that people post on a social networking website. So, for example, if you were using Instagram or you were using X or Facebook, if you were posting something, how could AI improve or impact the way those posts are being handled? So again, they've given you 3 bullet points, and for a full response, you should cover all 3 bullet points, but talk about the pros and cons within that. So for example, for legal issues, you might touch on the Copyright Designs and Patents Act. So for example, if you were posting something like a video or an image, you would want to make sure that what you're posting does not contravene the Copyright Designs and Patents Act, is not a form of plagiarism, and you'd want to make sure that the materials fall within the legal guidelines. You'd also want to touch on the Data Protection Act to make sure that rules are being followed so that the AI algorithm does not breach data privacy, and it ensures that anything that's related to a living individual is secure. You might also want to touch on, I suppose, in terms of ethical, the social networking site should demonstrate or make explicit how AI is being used, and the user has to then agree the terms and conditions when signing up for an account and what they can expect when they're posting. In terms of privacy issues, you may, again, similar to the previous question, if you were a user and your posts were being monitored all the time, how might that make you feel? Is it an invasion of privacy? Is there a certain mistrust? Again, when you're signing the terms and conditions, what are you signing up to, and whether that's made explicit or not. But on the positive, people might prefer a system analysing their posts, because that could potentially boost their viewing, but also ensure that what they're posting falls within legal guidelines as well. Also makes users feel safe, so that essentially what they are posting is not deemed as inappropriate as well. Okay, I would then end with a conclusion to say post this discussion, whether you think it's a good or a bad idea, maybe give an example and I think because you're teenagers, you might talk about a social media platform that you use and link it with a real life example. So, as a teenager, I post lots of things up on my profile. Sometimes it can be political, sometimes it can be, pictures that have been taken from other places, and you want to make sure that you are compliant with both legislation and ethics as well. So perhaps it's a good thing. Okay, there's no right or wrong answer in terms of what you think, but you should always try and back it up with an example. So similar to the previous questions, you've been given 3 bullet points. You should cover all 3, the legal, ethical and privacy issues, but you must link it back into the scenario. So for this scenario, you are a student and you're allowed to bring your own electronic device rather than the school purchasing new equipment. So for the school, I suppose ethically it means that they're not having to spend lots of money on purchasing new equipment, and they could spend that money elsewhere. However, for a student, is there a pressure again to have the best device? And does that then lead to a digital divide? Because there are some students that have access and some that do not. And then that also then means that lots of students are coming in at different levels and are not necessarily having access to things, I suppose, in an equal manner. In terms of legal issues, whose responsibility is it if that device is damaged? Is it the school or is it the students, because the student owns that property? And then also linked to legal issues is things like child safety or keeping children safe in education. So if you are bringing your own device, the college has a responsibility to make sure you're not accessing things on that device that are deemed inappropriate. So that might mean enforcing restrictions onto the network, but also ensuring that when you are bringing a device, you're not also bringing in a system that, a device that has harmful software on there, because that could then infect the network. In terms of privacy, so if you are then signing onto the school's network using your personal device, remember everything that's being done on that device is then going to be subject to monitoring. Okay, so it's probably something similar that your school already has. If you're signing onto your school's Wi-Fi, there are going to be the same filters applied, so you'd be banned from using certain websites or certain services, but also everything you do on that device will also be monitored. The school might also want to install their own software on your devices for tracking purposes, but also to ensure that we're maintaining security of our own networks as well. The only other issue I suppose linked to privacy is most devices now have inbuilt cameras. How are we going to govern students to use those devices sensibly so that they're not imposing on the privacy of others, for example, using the camera to record other students. Okay, so I would then conclude and summarize the points that I've discussed and give a balanced view on the practice of bringing personal devices. So yeah, I suppose you could say there's pros and cons. It is a good idea for students because they demonstrate responsibility of their own devices. However, they must comply with the legal and privacy uh, protocols that the school has in place. So yeah, I suppose again here, in your conclusion, I wouldn't add too much to it, but just offer a really balanced view. This question is really similar to all the other ones around emerging technology, and you are asked to discuss your understanding of emerging technology, in this context, AI, in the use of medical research, and always link it back to the scenario. Again, you've been given 3 bullet points. For full marks, you must cover all 3 bullet points, and give some pros and cons for each of those. So let's jump straight into ethical issues. So if you were a medical researcher and you were making use of a system that is making decisions for you or generating data or processing data at huge volumes, what impact would that have? So firstly, in terms of pros, you could have more reliable calculations, you could increase productivity because you are generating lots of data at a very short space of time. That could lead to finding a cure faster for the disease, which then can lead to saving more lives. However, on the flip side, that could mean that you're replacing people with machines, which then leads to loss of jobs or a change in jobs. So some people that may not necessarily have been using AI or technology in their jobs may become de-skilled or may have to change the way they do things. And as a result, that could increase redundancies as well. In terms of legal issues, remember you are working with patients. Patients are living individuals, so their data will be stored in a system. Who is responsible if there is an error or if there's a breach in data privacy? Is there a risk of threats, for example, hackers? And are there any risks if that data is not backed up? But on the flip side, you might say that actually for systems handling this data, it might be more secure than multiple people or multiple researchers having access to that data where it may not necessarily be secure. In terms of cultural, it's linked to the ethical issues. So you might say, for example, if there's removal of people from the workforce, that drives up redundancies, which is not good for society. But also it means that workers are becoming de-skilled at quite a fast rate. But on the flip side, it could increase different types of jobs. So, for example, rather than struggling to find medical experts because there is quite a shortage of those skills nationally. You could say people that have understanding of technology um, would be more beneficial in terms of recruitment as well. Okay, you might want to conclude here to say I've discussed the pros and cons, and essentially you could say that it's a good thing because it increases productivity and gets to results faster, but then you need to balance that with things like job losses and recruitment implications. Okay, this is a slightly different question in that it's not linked to legal, moral, ethical issues. It's more about your understanding of different technologies. In this case, storage media devices. So I would briefly introduce Kerry's decision to transfer files and the two types of storage media being considered, the optical and solid state devices. The examiner wants to see whether you've understood how both work and in which scenarios both would be best to deploy. You should already know the different characteristics to consider when you are looking at storage devices. So we're talking about portability, robustness, capacity, and cost, speed of data transfer as well. Okay, so I would maybe take each of those and discuss the differences between the optical and solid state devices. So, for example, if you're talking about portability, optical devices are quite portable, okay, because a CD and a DVD, they're really lightweight, they're small, making it easy to carry, and you can plug and play in different devices. However, the problem there is lots of modern laptops don't have a built-in CD drive. If you're thinking about solid state drives, again, they are highly portable. They're lightweight and can be carried in a pocket or in a, if we're talking about USB memory sticks. But also you've got solid state memory devices in your mobile phone as well. They don't require a special drive to be read, as most modern devices have USB ports, so you could plug them in. So think about how you could do data transfer between your mobile phone and your home computers or your laptops. Okay, so then link it back to the scenario. So you could say, in terms of portability, Kerry can easily carry a flash drive or a solid state drive because it makes it accessible on any modern day PC. In terms of robustness, so think about which one is going to be more fragile than the other. Remember, optical discs can get scratched easily and they're prone to physical damage. With solid state drive, there's no movable parts, okay, and if you drop your mobile phone, for example, you're unlikely to get damage on your data because it's quite robust. In terms of capacity, both have quite high capacity, but it comes at cost. So link in your understanding of cost. Remember, a CD is relatively cheaper compared to a solid state drive per gigabyte. So think about on your mobile phones when you're paying for your contracts, the higher the capacity of your solid state memory card, the higher your bill is going to be or your monthly payments. And that's because that technology is a lot more expensive at the moment. Okay, so the cost on a CD drive, obviously CD or an optical memory device is going to be relatively cheaper per gigabyte, but it's prone to, I suppose, damage. Okay, in your conclusion, I'd summarize the points and maybe make a recommendation for the medium term in relation to the scenario. In this question, you are to demonstrate your understanding of technology in a wider context and its impact on society. So again, you've been given 4 bullet points. If you want to get the full marks, you should cover all 4 bullet points, thinking about the pros and cons on the 100 people living on this island. So let's kick into the impacts on inhabitants. So imagine not having access to technology and then all of a sudden getting access to that technology and what the implications could be. For example, you've got access to a wealth of information that you may not necessarily would have had prior to that. So you could maybe touch on educational resources, news, entertainment, and then generally expanding your worldview and knowledge. You might then talk about different ways of communicating instantly with people outside of the island, so using social media apps or being able to do video calls, and how that can foster better connectivity with the global community, and then allowing you to stay in touch with family and friends globally. You might then touch on impacts of the business. So if you were a local business on a remote island, you could maybe reach out to global customers by selling goods and services online. That could open up new markets and help you diversify your income sources. It could also improve efficiency because you've got access to the internet. You might be able to manage your resources better. You might be able to use email communication and e-commerce platforms to be able to reach out to a wider customer base. You could give an example of like a small fishing business or local produce like fruit and veg, and how you could sell your products online or access market trends to increase your income. In terms of ethical issues, you might talk about the digital divide, because not all people on this remote island would have necessarily used technology or the hardware and software, and therefore will have different levels of IT skills. Okay, and you might give an example of like an elderly resident on this remote island and how they might feel like they are struggling to get the benefits from this new technology. In terms of ethical issues, there is also a cultural change. So if you were never exposed to global communication or trends outside of your island, it could maybe change your viewpoints or your traditions and your cultures from that island. Um, and that could lead to ethical concerns about your cultural preservation versus modernization. Um, give examples of how like a younger generation might jump onto a viral kind of trend that's influenced by kind of global culture, and how that could lead to tensions between maintaining traditional lifestyles versus modern practices as well. In terms of privacy issues, remember, you've never had access to the internet and all of a sudden you have. What does that mean about your personal privacy when you're posting things online or you're communicating with people? Are these people going to be aware of the risks associated with personal information sharing, and what could that lead to in terms of privacy and exploitation as well? And as with everything online, you have a global connectivity. Is there an increased risk of surveillance? And what could that mean in terms of what they're capturing about these inhabitants on this remote island, and what those implications are? So in terms of conclusion, what I would do is probably say that this is going to be a shift in practice for the inhabitants. It can increase things like communication, their contact with the outside world, create new revenue streams. But with that, it's really important that these inhabitants are educated on how to use this safely and securely in a way to benefit them.